Water Quality Control. Chapter 6 learning outcomes are: list and characterize major classes of water pollutants as well as other water quality issues, evaluate the effectiveness of water quality regulation, describe the mechanisms with current statutes set forth to ensure water quality, compare the structures of water quality and air quality control programs, discuss the Federal Water Pollution Control Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, explain water rights issues, evaluate how surface water quality is regulated, evaluate how groundwater quality is regulated. Major water pollutants, pathogens. Pathogens are disease-causing agents. Infectious disease from unsafe water is a much more prevalent problem in developing countries, though progress is being made thanks to international efforts. Waterborne pathogens can spread by ingestion, drinking or eating, skin exposure, water-dependent vectors like mosquitoes, and inadequate sanitation or sewage systems. Types of pathogens include bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and parasitic worms. Detection of coliform bacteria is used as an indicator for the presence of fecal matter, though there's a movement away from these species toward E. coli and enterococci. Diarrhea is a common sign of bacterial infection. Cholera, typhoid fever, shigellosis, and bacterial gastroenteritis are among the more important waterborne bacterial diseases. They are transmitted through the contact with water contaminated by waste from infected individuals. These diseases, characterized by severe diarrhea, can result in death, particularly in weaker individuals such as the very young and old, or those suffering from other stressors such as malnutrition. Viruses are more difficult to detect and eliminate than bacteria. Infectious hepatitis and virogastroenteritis, or norovirus, are the primary virus-caused waterborne diseases. These diseases may be contracted from drinking water that standard tests indicate are safe from bacterial contamination. No routine, inexpensive tests are currently available to search directly for the presence of viruses. Protozoa and parasitic worms are more complex organisms than bacteria and viruses. Protozoa, Giardia lambilla and Cryptosporidium species, are responsible for waterborne illnesses common to camping and to issues associated with failed water purification. In addition, there are waterborne diseases caused by parasitic worms. Conventional organics, biological oxygen demand, BOD, and chemical oxygen demand, COD. Organic compounds have carbon as a constituent. They are found in the living and dead organic matter. Organic pollution is generated in processes such as the combustion and refining of fossil fuels, food processing, municipal wastewater, and animal waste in agriculture. In aquatic systems, organic matter is used as food by microorganisms, thus promoting rapid growth of the microbial community, which results in rapid depletion of dissolved oxygen from the surrounding water. If the amount of food exceeds the available oxygen, the water becomes anoxic, and this kills aquatic animals, such as fish. Large quantities of organic matter may support the overgrowth of nuisance organisms such as filamentous bacteria and algae, resulting in clogs in water systems, unsightly alterations in the waterway, and objectionable smells. Two useful measures of water contamination are the biological oxygen demand and the chemical oxygen demand. The higher these demands, the more conventional organics there are in the water. Total organic carbon TOC measures all organic carbon that is not accounted for by the BOD and the COD. The promulgation of regulations based on the Clean Water Act has resulted in a list of conventional pollutants. These conventional pollutants are those that are amenable to treatment via the conventional municipal sewage treatment plant. They include biological oxygen demand, fecal coliform bacteria, oil and grease, pH, which refers to pHs that are exceeding regulatory limits, and total suspended solids, or TSS. Toxic trace organics, harmful at extremely low concentrations. Examples: PCBs, PAHs, dioxins, pesticides, pharmaceuticals. Many bioaccumulate. Certain organic compounds are harmful at trace or extremely low concentrations. These compounds are classified as toxic. The primary concern is their direct harm to organisms, including humans. Most toxic organics are created as chemical byproducts of industrial processes and commercial product synthesis. Historically, concern has focused on compounds such as polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, polycyclic aromatic compounds, PAHs, dioxins, solvents, and pesticides. In more recent years, we have recognized the accumulation of byproducts associated with disinfectants like chlorine in water treatment, disinfectants byproducts, or DBPs. Further, while the conventional wastewater treatment is sufficient to eliminate much of the biodegradable carbon compounds, we are finding that compounds associated with pharmaceuticals and personal care products can persist despite traversing wastewater treatment. Many toxic organics persist in the environment and bioaccumulate in food chains. Further, the effects of contamination often are expressed only after considerable time. These characteristics greatly complicate efforts to relate exposure effects and to understand the relationship between a given dose and a probable outcome. The effects of trace organics on human health are diverse. Many organics are thought to be carcinogens, and regulatory decisions are often made based on this risk. Other effects may include mutagenesis, teratogenesis, nervous system damage, damage to the liver and other internal organ systems, and disruption of the endocrine system, resulting in developmental and reproductive problems. Ecological health effects from trace levels of organics are even more variable and difficult to quantify than human health effects, yet instances of harm have been documented. Perhaps one of the most well-known effects is the relationship between trace levels of dichlorophenol trichloroethane, DDT, and eggshell thinning in birds, resulting in severe population crashes in a number of species because of reproductive failure. The nutrients that most commonly cause problems are nitrogen and phosphorus because they can stimulate the most plant and algal growth. Nitrogen and phosphorus are found in runoff from agriculture, wastewater, and industrial processes. Overfertilization of these nutrients causes artificial eutrophication in aquatic systems, which can lead to anoxic conditions. Nitrogen and its nitrate form can also cause methylglobemia, one of the blue baby diseases, by reducing blood's oxygen carrying capacity in infants. Very young babies lack the enzyme necessary to fight nitrate buildup. This syndrome disrupts development and can be lethal. Heavy metals. Heavy metals are a group of toxic elements that are sometimes present naturally, but found in higher concentrations due to contaminated water discharge. Examples include arsenic, mercury, and lead. Contamination can come from mining or refining of these metals, infrastructure, and leaching from other sources. These metals are toxic even at low concentrations. They can bioaccumulate and biomagnify, resulting in bans of fish consumption from polluted waterways. Ionizing radiation. Radiation is the release of energy via subatomic particles. Radioactive substances have an unstable balance of neutrons and protons, so they emit charged particles to achieve stability. Ions are atoms with a charge or an unbalanced number of protons or electrons. Alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays may be emitted. Alpha particles have low penetrating ability, but can cause damage when inside the body. Gamma rays, by contrast, have high penetration power, but contain less energy. Radiation does occur naturally, since atoms are continually decaying. The health effects from ionizing radiation can include cell death and damage to the reproductive process of cells, including mutations that result in cells becoming cancerous, or they may not be observable. Keep in mind that exposure to ionizing radiation comes from many natural resources, and water typically is an extremely minor contributor to most people's total radiation dose. Other measures of water quality include mineral content, dissolved solids, pH, and temperature. These affect physical and chemical properties of water as well as impact aquatic organisms more directly. Trace levels of toxic organics. Chlorine has helped to reduce the incidence of waterborne diseases and is a popular disinfectant for home uses. However, it creates disinfectant byproducts, which are formed by reactions between disinfectant and organic matter. There are hundreds of recognized compounds that form as these byproducts, including trihalomethanes, haloacetic acids, bromate, and chlorite. DBPs are known to be associated with incidence of bladder cancer. Disinfection is necessary. Alternate treatment options are important to safeguard human health. Organic solvents and pesticide pollution are also contamination issues. Solvents are difficult to detect and may persist in underground water supplies. Pesticides can run off of fields and into municipal supplies. But as with hormones and antibiotics, regulations may not be stringent enough to fully protect human health. Pharmaceutical drugs are detectable in a large number of waterways, and studies are being conducted to determine their effect on aquatic life and aquatic habitats. Lead and copper. Lead contamination primarily comes from untreated water sources and plumbing systems leaching. Less than 1% of public water supplies are potentially contaminated. A bigger problem is leaching from service lines and connections. Copper contamination also comes from leaching in metal plumbing. Exposure to high enough levels of lead and copper can lead to damage in multiple organ systems, but the extent of this damage relative to amounts of exposure is still subject to a lot of research. Public concern about radiation is increasing as nuclear energy receives attention as a potential alternative focus to fossil fuels for electricity generation. The 2011 containment failures at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant following the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami made many question the reasonableness of nuclear power generation. In drinking water, radioactivity is regulated by limiting concentration of radionuclides, which are a measure of the radioactive decay. The most important source of radiation in drinking water is radon, an invisible, odorless radioactive gas that is almost ubiquitous in its distribution. Natural surface water generally carries little threat of human radiation contamination because radon volatilizes into the atmosphere. Groundwater can have relatively high concentrations of radon because of the sustained association with uranium and radium in naturally occurring radon-emitting rock, with little chance of removal through volatilization. The threat to human health from radon is predominantly from airborne exposure. Radon is second only to tobacco smoke as the most important environmental factor responsible for lung cancer. Thus, water containing elevated radon concentrations presents a threat largely from the radon gas released from water vapor, for example during showering, rather than from direct consumption. Although the EPA proposed a rule on radon in drinking water in 1999, no final rule has ever been promulgated. More studies into recreational waters are revealing health risks such as pathogens and pollution. Stormwater, sewage, treatment facilities, and other waste systems all contribute to beach water pollution. The Beaches Environmental Assessment and Coastal Health Beach Act of 2000 supports testing and federal standard compliance for pathogen levels, but it has not been effectively enforced. Concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, are of increasing public interest. In CAFOs, animals are packed into limited space, which has disease and waste implications. Manure, pathogens, and sediments cause water quality issues. These facilities also require an immense amount of water to operate. Concerns associated with CAFOs make them common LULUs, locally unwanted land uses. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, is also of recent public interest. Fracking is the process of pumping or injecting highly pressurized fluids underground to open up rock formations containing natural gas. The openings allow the natural gas to enter collection wells. The fluids used have complex chemical formulas that include toxic and/or harmful compounds. Fracking also produces a lot of wastewater because the injected or pumped fluids return to the surface containing salts, metals, and chemicals. Policies and regulations have yet to keep up with the fracking technology advances, and this causes frustration within the environmental community, even though natural gas as a resource is a cleaner alternative to other fossil fuels. Most bottled water is taken from municipal water sources. However, they tend to receive additional treatment. Perhaps the most significant and certainly most obvious difference between bottled and municipal sources from the United States is that municipal water has a residual disinfectant, usually chlorine, while bottled water does not. The additional treatment usually includes a process that removes disinfectants that were added to the municipal treatment source. The Food and Drug Administration has primary responsibility governing bottled water quality, in contrast to EPA's primary role governing municipal water quality. The federal government controls surface and domestic water quality through the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, FWPCA, frequently referred to as the Clean Water Act, and also the Safe Drinking Water Act, SDWA. To properly focus on water quality issues, it's also important to understand how rights to use the water are obtained in the United States. Water rights are traditionally a state issue, with only limited involvement on the federal level. Specific policies governing rights to water reflect the tradition brought into the state by its founders and the nature of the state's water resources. Federal activity largely involves situations in which waters flow through or is located across more than one state or country. Water rights refer to the right to surface waters, generally speaking, in the states with greater abundance of water, mostly in the eastern United States. The right to use water is associated with the physical link to the water. The owner of the property alongside a stream, river, or lake may make reasonable use of the water. This is called riparian right. In many western states, where water is scarce, rights can be claimed for beneficial uses both adjacent to and away from water sources. Rights are prioritized with respect to time. If supply is limited, the first to acquire the right can have all the supply. Only after an earlier right has been exhausted can later rights be met. This is called the appropriative right. Groundwater traditionally has been governed differently, with the overlying landowner having rights to pump. However, this right is now being controlled in many states because pumping can affect neighboring users' groundwater and surface water supplies. Under riparian rights, each owner of riparian land is entitled to receive water undiminished in quality or quantity by upstream users. Thus, each riparian landowner is obligated to not degrade the water source. Riparian landowners in all states, including those with appropriative water laws, generally have the rights to use their adjoining surface waters for such non-consumptive uses as fishing and recreation. Within states using a riparian system to control consumptive uses, water diversion by a riparian historically was restricted to domestic use. Upstream landowners could not divert water to irrigate fields to use in mining or industry, or any other use in which the quality and quantity of the downstream supply would be reduced. Today, the historic restriction to domestic use has been replaced in most states by one that limits diversions to those needed for reasonable use. Under this doctrine, a riparian landowner may divert water if the use does not interfere with the legitimate use of the water by other holders of riparian rights. States individually determine reasonable use based on such factors as the following: purpose of the use, suitability of the use to the water course, economic value of the use, social value of the use, harm associated with the use, practicality of avoiding the harm, practicality of adjusting the quantity of water use, protection of existing values of the water and associated land, equity between the water user and any injured parties. Most of the western United States is drier than the east, and the water supply is much more limited. For development to occur, water must be available and long-term rights secured. The system of appropriative water rights provides a mechanism for obtaining water rights as a function of water use. The use of water gives the user a right to the water supply. The earliest water users have priority using the water supply if the supply is limited. Subsequent water users have inferior rights. Water is appropriated and rights established through the actual consumptive use of water. Diverting water and returning some portion of the water, such as returning power plant cooling water, only establishes a right to the net amount removed. If the water is not used where the appropriative right exists, the right can be lost. An appropriative right is not dependent on land ownership, but on diverting and consumptively using water for beneficial use. Most states with appropriative systems also have statutes that govern how much water can be taken and specify beneficial uses. Typically, agricultural, industrial, and domestic uses are all accepted as rights that may be secured. Appropriative rights are complicated by the varying availability of water. In a wet year, all rights might be satisfied. In a dry year, many users may have unmet needs. Historically, groundwater was based on land ownership. Those owning the land and had unlimited right to pump water from beneath their land, much as they had unlimited right to the air overlying the land. This doctrine is known as the English rule. This approach was useful when water withdrawal was relatively low, such that a landowner tapping an underlying aquifer did not substantially affect other landowners' wells or draw down streams and other surface waters that were connected hydrologically to the groundwater. However, as knowledge grew of the interrelationship between withdrawing groundwater from an individual well and the local and regional water supply, including both surface water and groundwater, restrictions began to be placed on groundwater use. These restrictions follow a reasonable use or American rule doctrine. Today, groundwater is regulated in most states as a public good with little remaining of the English rule other than the practice in a few states with little history of water scarcity. Groundwater regulation is done largely at the state and local levels. Although the federal government has extensive control over surface water resources, there is not a parallel for groundwater. Groundwater, not affecting navigable waters of the nation, generally is not seen as under federal constitutional jurisdiction. The federal government may have some ability to regulate groundwater linked hydrologically to surface water, but this ability has not been thoroughly exercised or tested in the court. The federal government has largely deferred groundwater issues to state law. Until relatively recently, protecting water quality was not a major concern for the federal government. With a growing population and increasing rate of waterborne disease, the need for a more active federal role became evident. During the late 1960s, a series of events turned public attention toward the deteriorating environment and led to a public demand for action. In 1969, in June, the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland caught fire. Clearly, this river was little more than an industrial sewer, with oily waste concentrating sufficiently to turn a major waterway into a fire hazard. Soon after, more than 250 million gallons of crude oil leaked from an oil drilling operation offshore of Santa Barbara, California. The media gave substantial coverage to both events, and pictures of dead, oil-coated waterfowl, sea otters, and other wildlife crowded the front pages of newspapers. The public was ready to support major changes. In response, Congress passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, FWPCA, of 1972. Passage of this statute required the legislature to overturn the veto of President Nixon. FWPCA mandated major changes in the way water quality could be controlled in the United States and provided the basis for water quality programs used today. 3 subsequent acts made substantial amendments to the FWPCA: the Clean Water Act of 1977, the Water Quality Act of 1987, and the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. These amendments followed the basic principles established in 1972 Act and have resulted in a complex and comprehensive system of water pollution control. A strong federal role is now integral to our system of water quality protection. Ambitious water quality objectives are clearly established for the nation. Quote, "The objective of this act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters." Unquote. Note that water quality goals include more than maintaining a safe drinking water supply. Specific reference is made to providing for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. Thus, all waters of the nation are required to be fit for fishing and swimming. To protect water quality, there were 2 options proposed. 1, restrictions set on pollutant dischargers, and 2, ambient water quality standards established. The law adopted both approaches, although the majority of the regulatory activity has focused on controlling individual dischargers. All discrete point sources of discharge into surface water, such as factories, pulp and paper mills, food processing plants, and municipal wastewater treatment plants, are required to obtain an NPDES discharge permit. NPDES stands for the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. In addition, permits are required of municipal and industrial stormwater systems and many concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. Over 400,000 sources are now regulated by these permits nationwide. Effluent limitations are dependent on the type of pollutant, type of discharger, and characteristic of the local watershed. In setting these limitations, 3 broad categories of pollutants are identified: conventional, non-conventional, and toxic. The least stringent level of control is imposed on existing dischargers of conventional pollutants, requiring only the best conventional pollutant control technology (BCT) standards are met. Only 5 conventional pollutants are specified: biochemical oxygen demand (BOD), total suspended solids (TSS), pH, and fecal coliform were established in 1977 amendments, and the EPA subsequently added oil and grease. Toxic and conventional pollutants must be controlled by using the best available economically achievable BAT, or more rigorous standard, a more rigorous standard than BCT. Non-conventional pollutants are anything not included in these other 2 categories that still may pose a threat to water quality, such as thermal pollution. To help identify toxic pollutants, a list of 65 toxic chemicals known as priority pollutants was developed by the EPA. This list includes individual chemicals and chemical groups. However, effluent standards are not restricted to these 65 chemicals or chemical groups. In establishing effluent limitations, the EPA can establish specific chemical standards in response to particular types of chemicals used by that industry. The 1977 amendments to the Act specify that effluent standards for toxic pollutants consider the toxicity of the pollutant, its persistence, degradability, the usual or potential presence of the affected organisms in any waters, the importance of affected organisms, and the nature and extent of the effect of the toxic pollutant on such organisms, and the extent to which effective control is being or may be achieved under other regulatory authority. The system for controlling effluent from publicly owned treatment works, POTWs, differs slightly from that of other dischargers. POTWs must meet effluent standards characterized by waste receiving secondary treatment. The EPA initially defined secondary treatment to effectively limit compliance to communities using activated sludge technology meeting rigorous performance standards. This requirement was subsequently viewed as excessive in many situations, particularly where small POTWs were discharging into waters capable of rapidly assimilating the wastewater. Also, it was viewed as economically impractical and ecologically unnecessary for many small communities. Therefore, these requirements were modified. A system also is in place to control industrial discharges of pollutants into municipal sewage. Industry must pre-treat their wastewater to meet quality standards. These standards are designed to prevent the introduction of pollutants into sewers that will interfere with the operations of the POTW. These pretreatment regulations also are intended to ensure that the hazardous waste management system is not circumvented through the use of municipal sewers. Most of the regulatory burden for the pretreatment is on local POTWs. The NPDES system is administered through the EPA. However, similar to many environmental statutes, most of the states have assumed active management responsibilities with EPA maintaining an oversight role. National effluent guidelines and standards have been promulgated for 58 industry types, Table 6.1 in your book, and work is proceeding to establish several more. Facilities not associated with a specific category must meet general discharge requirements intended to protect water quality. A regulatory system addressing stormwater discharge from industrial and municipal sources required by the Water Quality Act has matured considerably over the past decade. Facilities discharging in municipal stormwater sewers and falling into one of 10 industry categories also must obtain an NPDES stormwater permit. The EPA developed a multi-sector general permit, MSGP 2000, to specify permit conditions, which includes development and implementation of a stormwater pollution prevention plan, SWPPP. Construction activities disturbing at least 1 acre must require an NPDES permit and a notice of intent and prepare a stormwater pollution prevention plan. In addition to a nationally based system of discharge control based on industry types, a second regulatory strategy is based on ambient water quality. Subject to federal review, states are required to establish water quality standards for intrastate waters. These water quality standards must specify the designated use of the water, recreation, water supply, aquatic life, or agriculture, for example, criteria to protect the designated use, and an anti-degradation policy. Furthermore, states are required to evaluate their water quality biennially. However, most states have been evaluating only a small fraction of their surface waters. Of that fraction assessed, much of the water is of impaired quality. Although many major point sources of pollution, for example, factory effluents, have been effectively controlled, and the system for controlling stormwater is maturing, the waters of the nation continue to fail to meet required standards. Groundwater does not have identical regulatory protection as surface water. Much of the control of groundwater quality, as well as groundwater usage, occurs at the local and state level, although a variety of national laws influence groundwater quality. In particular, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, SWDA, have provisions that specifically address protection of groundwater quality. Under the authority of the Safe Drinking Water Act and its amendments, several programs have been implemented that may help protect groundwater useful as drinking water supply. The Underground Injection Control Program, UIC, was established in the Safe Drinking Water Act and gave the EPA authority to control intentional injections of fluids underground. This power was granted because underground injection of waste for disposal and injection of water or other fluids to enhance recovery of oil and gas both can lead to contamination of aquifers used for drinking water supplies. The Sole Source Aquifer Protection Program provides additional protection to groundwater through establishing a federal role for aquifers that provide more than 50% of the local population with its primary source of drinking water. Established in the Safe Drinking Water Act and reauthorized in 1996 amendments, individuals, communities, and organizations may petition the EPA for protection of their sole source drinking water supply. If a project potentially affecting a sole source aquifer has federal involvement, the EPA may review and approve the project. Historically, drinking water protection was the responsibility of the individual states, not the federal government. The quality of the drinking water was governed by local and state boards of health or was not governed at all. The role of the federal government was limited largely to providing research grants, loans for development of treatment works, and technical assistance, and to being involved in interstate and international quality issues. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed in response to a growing concern over contamination of domestic supplies with synthetic organic chemicals and other pollutants. The statute required the development of national domestic water quality standards. It also provided for the protection of groundwater supplies, the source of domestic water for about 50% of the U.S. population. This act was intended to protect public water supply systems and to ensure that they supply potable water free from biological, chemical, and physical contamination. Non-public systems, such as wells supplying individual homes, were not targeted for protection. Public water systems subject to Safe Drinking Water Act requirements are defined as systems that have at least 15 service connections or serve 25 or more people for at least 60 days annually. Amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act made in 1986 provided a new timetable for establishing water quality standards and expanded the number of contaminants to be considered. For contaminants that may have an adverse effect on human health, the EPA is responsible for developing concurrently maximum contaminant level goals and maximum contaminant levels. Maximum contaminant level goals, MCLGS, are non-enforceable health goals. They are levels at which no adverse health effects should occur. Maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, are enforceable standards set as close to the MCLGs as possible, but they take into account the feasibility of achieving standards based on available technology and the costs of treatment. A more recently identified threat to water systems is from terrorism. Water may be contaminated with biological, chemical, or radioactive agents, or water systems may be physically destroyed or damaged. Obtaining hazardous agents may not be difficult. A number of pathogenic bacteria, viruses, and protozoa can be recovered from natural sources or easily cultured and grown. Toxic chemicals may be purchased or synthesized, and radioactive material is not universally secure. The Public Health, Security, and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002 included provisions for protecting community drinking water systems. Every community water system serving a population of greater than 3,300 persons was required to conduct a vulnerability assessment of the system, submit the assessment to the EPA, and certify that the system had a current emergency response plan. Bottled water is not regulated through the Safe Drinking Water Act or other EPA-administered laws, but instead it's under the purview of the Food and Drug Administration as a packaged food item. Bottled water includes water labeled bottled water, drinking water, artesian water, mineral water, sparkling bottled water, spring water, purified water, including those further identified as distilled, demineralized, deionized, or a product of reverse osmosis. Carbonated waters are regulated as soft drinks. Identical to all food items regulated by the FDA, bottled water is required to be packaged in a sanitary environment following a sanitary process into a sanitary container. The water must come from either a protected natural source, such as a spring that is protected from surface water contamination, or a municipal supply. If the water originates from a non-potable source, the source must be identified on the bottle. Of course, water originating from a non-potable source must be treated to make it potable.